So this video is one part of a larger series I'm making showing how I do a large built-in for a customer. This video in particular is going to cover the 14-foot tabletop, but a lot of it is going to be about how I constructed these pullouts. It might not seem like a lot of work, but I had a lot of stipulations in the measurements, which made it so I didn't have a lot of wiggle room up top. Ideally, I could have made this space much thicker. It would have made it a little bit easier to do, potentially use some mechanical draw pulls or something like that, but the height of this is for a desk, so that was set. The base was set for the molding, and then the drawers below this, if you've been watching the series, you know that they're filing cabinets, and those had to be a certain height in order to actually fit the files. So for this top part, I only had about 1.5 inches to play around with, and that kind of dictated how I went about engineering it. So you can see I left this void up top. It's about 1/4 inch, and the first part of this process is removing the front part of that face frame so that the pull can actually come out. I did this with a very inexpensive router bit because I needed a router bit that had a bottom mount bearing, and the ones I had in the shop for that were not great, so that's why I went so slowly moving that material. But as you can see, that bearing basically rode along the plywood and cut that front part flush. Then I could go about and measure the void I had left, and I could cut a piece of plywood to fit. You can see I have this framed out with poplar because the edges of this are going to be hardwood. Because it's going to slide, and the way I designed it is that it's going to slide between 2 pieces of ply. I didn't want to put that glue-on edge banding on there because I just feel like over time the wear and tear of it would break it down. So I measured those. The 2 cabinets are pretty similar in size, but they're slightly different. Within, I think it was something very, very small, like 1/4 inch. So they are slightly different sizes, but for the purposes of this video, I made them essentially the same way. So I ripped down a piece of ply. You can see now I'm going to cut it to size, and like I said, I accounted for the front and the 2 sides as being a poplar hardwood, so it's going to be a little bit smaller than that opening. Now the problem with plywood, and I say this whenever I work with it, and making this out of MDF was in my book not an option. Plywood looks flat, but these are very large chunks. You saw they're over 3 feet wide, over 2 feet deep. They're not going to be perfectly flat. So that is going to be kind of the first issue I had to deal with. But that's kind of in the future a little bit for this video. As of right now, I'm just going to be adding splines and putting the sides in place. So like I said, the outer edge is going to be poplar. That's what I have in the shop for the face frames. I ripped it down to size. Now the plywood itself, it's 3/4 inch plywood, which means it's closer to 23/32. So I actually ripped that poplar down to 23/32, so it's not proud of the ply. And you could see that stack of poplar I have on the side, and then I had some 1/4 inch material laying around, which I'm using for the splines. Now I get asked this question a lot because I upload portions of these videos to other forms of social media, so I had a lot of people asking why I did a removable spline. Sometimes I do a fixed ton and groove for stuff like that. If you watch the whole series, I do that for the upper cabinets. Sometimes I cut the splines on the table saw. Sometimes I cut the splines with the router. It's a multitude of reasons where that dictates why I do that. For this, I was cutting these on the table saw because they're smaller pieces, so it's easier to do. Sometimes I cut them with a router on bigger pieces that are harder to manhandle on the table saw, and sometimes I do it with the tongue and groove because I don't have enough spline material to cut those. There's many ways to go about making a spline if you want to attach things this way. If you watch the whole series, I think I cover about 3 of them in the video, but for the purposes of this, I have a dado stack in my table saw, my tall fence up because these pieces are obviously taller than just the regular fence, and all I'm doing is I'm sending all of my pieces through, which means that this doesn't necessarily have to be centered because they're all going to be the same piece. And I'm just adding a groove to all of my pieces, which means I can then take that spline that you saw me cut, put that spline in the groove, and attach it that way. That was just happened to be the way I decided to do it for this section of the build. Like I said before, there's many different options. If you don't want to use biscuits, which I don't prefer, or you don't want to use pocket screws, which I also do not prefer. So zoomed out a little bit, you could see these smaller pieces, like I said, are easier to send through the table saw without worrying about them not being super accurate. So that is what I decided to do. I could put that spline in place, put that poplar piece on edge, like I said, and glue the whole thing in place. Once again, paint grade project. I've been saying this throughout the build, so I just attach this with brads instead of spending the time to wait for clamps. The brads will be enough to hold this in place as the glue dries. You could miter these corners. I decided not to. I'm just going to patch them with some putty, and you won't see that groove once everything is painted. So when I put them back in place, they were a little bit proud of the front, which is totally fine. So I reversed them, so I'm actually cutting the back, and I'm just using the face frame of the cabinet to ride that bearing along the front, and this will get it so that it's oriented perfectly in that piece. I didn't want this to be recessed in the cabinet. I didn't want it to be proud of the cabinet, so doing it this way will make it perfectly flush. Once again, very cheap bit, so I'm taking these cuts slower so it doesn't tear out any pieces. You can flip it back around and you can see that now it fits in there perfectly. So if you've ever done any sort of wooden runners or wooden pullouts, it might seem like you want there to be space so that things don't drag, but in actuality you want the connections to be pretty tight. Otherwise, when you go to pull it out or push it back in, the corners have a tendency to catch, and then you can't actually smoothly pull it in and out. So what I decided to do was put 2 plywood runners on the side, but the issue with these large pullouts is I don't have a lot of material still in the cabinet. Ideally, with a cantilever, you're going to have almost as much material still set into the cabinet as much material is being pulled out. She wanted these to pull out as much as possible, so only have like 5 or 6 inches still left in the cabinet. So I was thinking of multiple ways to keep this as flat as possible when it was pulled out. So I decided to make basically these rabbets, which will then hold those dowels in place. Limiting my contact points will also make it easier to slide. So you can see I removed a fair amount of material from just a regular piece of ply, and then these dowels will sit underneath that ply. I can pull this out, and then the dowels against that ply will make it so it can't really lower as much as it would without them. So that was kind of the design I came up at first. I'm going to modify this throughout the video because I wasn't happy with it until basically my last rendering of it. So like I said, pretty simple stuff. I'm using plywood for this because plywood's dimensionally stable. One of my issues with this design in general is a lot of times you'll see these in kitchens and people use them as pullouts for cutting boards, and while there's a countertop on it, you can access the drawer from underneath. But because I needed a solid top for this, because these cabinets are so wide, all of this engineering is going to be buried in the built-in. So there's going to be a tabletop fixed in place on top of this, as well as large cabinets on top of it. It's a built-in, so I'm putting this in the space with no intention of it ever coming out. So what I mean by burying these mechanics are if these dowels malfunction over time, or any sort of other hardware I put in there malfunctions over time, it's going to be a real pain to access it. So that was something I was thinking about throughout this process as well. I don't see these dowels failing, which is one of the reasons I decided to do it this way. So you could see my tracks essentially on the side. These are my tracks, are screwed in place. Those dowels slide perfectly against the piece, and now you could see without the top on especially, those dowels keep it from going down a lot. It's fixed in place so it doesn't really torque one way or the other when it's pulled out. This first one I did, I was really happy with how it worked. It slid very easily. The second one was a little bit of a pain to get that one to work, but essentially they work the same way. So you can see once the tabletop is in place, it will hold it even more because it will be sitting on top of that ply. At this point, I was pretty happy with the progress. I was working on these set next to each other to make my life easier, but now I'm going to start doing the top so I could spread these apart, get them essentially to their final width. To do that, I add about 1/2 of an inch to this so that I could scribe these in place. So as you see it in my shop, this whole built-in is about, the base at least is about 1/2 of an inch too big for the space, and that is going to be for scribing. With that in mind, because there is this large void in the middle, I can essentially shrink this and make it wider if I have to, but I don't see that being an issue. So if you're watching this whole series, I'd already cut the 8-foot by 30-foot tops for the top of this when I was ripping down all of my ply, and this is basically what it is. This is just shy of 15 feet long, so it's quite large. Unfortunately, that means I'm going to have a seam, and the only spot that made sense to do it was right in the middle of the tabletop, which isn't ideal, but once again, paint braid project, that could be fixed. So I had to think of a way to mount this tabletop so it's easy to mount, easy to transport, and also sturdy. I still had some of these 2x4s left over from the base, and you could see that one of them twisted quite a bit even from the couple weeks this has been in my shop, which is why I always recommend, if you're using dimensional grade lumber, either let it sit and then work with it, or cut it and work with it pretty quickly. Otherwise, it is going to move on you. And like I said, basically my design for this is I have these little cleats that are going to catch both edges of the cabinet. This is not necessarily structural. Once it's in the space, this entire tabletop is going to get screwed to the frame. The whole top is not going to sit on these two cleats. The reason I did it this way is if I have to shrink that middle section or make it larger, I can with that design. It also makes it so that in the space, those two cleats will automatically sit on my leveled cabinets, and it's going to make installation a lot easier than if this middle portion was just free floating. So I could basically pick up this whole tabletop and put it back in place without having to mount any sort of cleats on the side in order to hold it. So that was the basis of that design. And because it is 2x4s, it's going to be extremely strong, especially once I add all my middle weights. So as you can see, my front 2x4 is pretty straight, so that is the one I chose for the front. The back one is the one that's a little wonky, which is nice. You'll never see it. I'm going to put a bottom on this and a front to cover all of this and make it a little stronger as well, so I'm not super worried about that. But basically, in order to join these two fronts, because the back one is really bowed, and I would have done it this way anyway, I'm going to put a series of dados in here and then a bunch of plywood in order to attach all these. So basically I just have that weight on one side. You can see I'm cutting both pieces at one time so I could flip it, and then all of my cuts are mirrored on each other side, so everything will be symmetrical once I put it back in the piece. It's kind of standard operating procedure for how I cut dados like this in the shop. So with those cleats and those notches cut out in my cabinet, you can see how everything will set in place. And then I'm going to use a clamp in order to close this gap a little bit, because that back one, like I keep saying, is really bowed. And then once I did that, I'm going to take my measurements from the side, because the side is going to be the closest to true versus the middle. They both matched at this point, and then I can add those scrap pieces of ply. You kind of see it, my glue ball's a little in the way. You could see just how twisted that back piece is. So I'm going to screw all this into place, which will help pull that back piece more square. And then, like I'm saying, it's now set back from my face frame by 3/4 of an inch. So on site, I could cut a nice piece of poplar and cover that front, and you won't see that piece. And then I could go by and put my tabletop back in place. I don't think I show it in this video, but I walk on top of this for a couple weeks making the upper cabinets. That middle tabletop is extremely strong. I have no doubt that it will withstand any sort of weight that they put on it, which most likely is not going to be much. It's going to be a computer. So then that top was a little too long because, like I said, this is a little under 15 feet. I had it at 16 feet. I just cut it on the radial arm saw. Like I said, everything's oversized. That tabletop is also going to have to be scribed to the space. So right now the plywood is flush with the cabinets, but it's going to be about 30 inches deep. So like I said, I'm going to be doing splines on this. I'm doing it a little bit differently versus the splines for the pullouts, and I'm using a router. I have a slot cutting bit that cuts a perfect 1/4 inch groove, and then I can put 1/4 inch material in there and attach these. So I'm doing that for the joint in the middle. I'm also going to be doing it by adding a hardwood front to the top of this. It's going to be much more durable than edge banding, and to be perfectly honest, I hate edge banding. I say that all the time, so I always prefer, if I can, putting hardwood edges on this. Obviously I'm not going to do that for stuff like the drawers. The tops of all that ply will get edge banded, but stuff like this I prefer the splines. The reason I chose the router is for this application versus the table saw is very simply to put that taking 8-foot by 30-foot pieces of ply and setting them on edge through the table saw is just not necessary when you have a router with a fence that will give you an accurate cut on the tabletop. So a lot of times decisions in the shop, or sometimes they're based on what I just feel like doing that day. When you've been doing this long enough, sometimes you just want to change it up a little bit, to be perfectly honest. But in this case, it was so that I didn't have to wrestle that plywood through the table saw. I can make the exact same groove on these 2 inches of ply, rip them into inch strips, which is what the face will be, and then I could just attach that to the front. So I always stagger the seams for stuff like this, so it's 8 feet coming off the right hand side, so I'm going to do 8 feet for the front coming off the left hand side, so it will cover that seam. Just makes it a little more durable on site. All of this will stay detached. I'm obviously not going to transport a 16-foot by 18-foot slab in my truck, so also keep in mind that's one of the reasons I do it that way. So then I kept coming back to this table, these pullouts, because the problem I had was because I had this clearance so tight, it was dragging on the top because I didn't have a lot of space on the top, and this plywood was a little bowed. So what I ended up doing was I went and put about a 3 30-seconds of an inch shim on the top of all of my cabinets, so I now had a space for these pullouts, and they worked much better that way. I also put some tape on the slides, which ended up coming off because it's essentially mounted vertically, that tape, and while it worked really well, I don't want the tape to get stuck in these slides because there's no way to access them. So I actually ended up ordering some thinner tape. I'm going to put it between the pullouts and the top of the cabinet before installation. So at this point, I still wasn't in love with how these were pulling out, so what I decided to do was have some contact points between the back of the ply and the tabletop. So I got these slides, which are for moving furniture. They cut down on friction, so things slide really easily. And basically, I'm just going to put a recessed groove on the back of this for these to set in, so the plastic slides will perfectly hit the top of the ply, and the slides will make it so they pull out a little bit easier, because I needed to add that groove, otherwise especially the one on the left hand side was not pulling out easily. But I still wanted there to be a contact point between the tabletop and the pullout, so this is kind of what I settled on for that. A lot of this process was kind of letting it set for a little bit. There's about a week's time between when I first engineered these to doing this, and then there's about another week's time between you'll see the other modification I made. So now with this pullout, like I said, this is the one that still sticks a little bit. You can see with that top on, I have the groove so I can slide in the front, but in the back, once the top is in place, there's now a contact point, and I was really trying to avoid that cantilever feeling flimsy and not being a solid work surface. So then, like I said, about a week later, I still wasn't in love with how these were functioning. I decided to add another fall safe to this. And basically what I'm doing is I'm making my own T-track in the top of the cabinet, so the T-bolts will hold down this ply a little bit better once it's pulled out. It was actually a pretty simple process. I just drilled some 5/16 inch dowel holes essentially into the back. I could slide this forward because it slides perfectly in between those two pieces of ply. Put a drill point in the front. I could connect those two holes and get a perfect T-slot for my T-bolts to slide in. I happen to have 5/16 inch T-bolts in the slot in the shop, so that's what I decided to use. I have this set of bushing guides, so there's a 1/4 inch bit in there, but I need my hole to be 5/16, so you kind of have to calculate the outside diameter of the bushing and the width that you want, so that's what those two marks are for. You can kind of see, I'm trying to show it here, but it's not the best view. That bushing will hit those outside marks, and that 1/4 inch bit will remove the material I need. You could see how it slides back and forth. Very simple. I just put 2 pieces of 3/4 inch ply for this my router to ride on, and I can make a groove. The 3/4 inch ply ended up being too tall, so I swapped it out with 1/2 inch, and that worked perfectly, and then I can make that perfect slot. So the principle behind this is the dowels are what tracks it to keep it pulling out perfect front to back. The friction stoppers on the back are so that slides a little bit nicer, and it hits the top of the ply so it can't lift down. The process behind this was keeping that plywood flat and helping the guides in the back so that when it's fully pulled out, it can't lift. That was the problem. She just wanted these to pull out a little bit too far for essentially what they should, but I think once I was all said and done, they actually work pretty well. So I put some T-nuts in the front. The T-bolts go to the bottom. You can see there's my track, and basically, like I said, now those bolts make it so that it actually cannot really lift forward. All of these 3 problem-solving techniques I came out with can probably be modified into 1 or 2, but essentially with stuff, especially if it's going to a customer, I'd rather over-engineer it than get a phone call a year from now because something isn't working. The thing I like about the T-bolts is you can access them from the cabinet, so if something ever does happen, you could work on them a little bit easier than the dowels. The other issue I was having is now this ply is sunken because I shimmed out that top. So I didn't have Luan in the shop, but a piece of Luan, I'm showing you an example with this pegboard, will also, I'm going to glue it to the top of that ply when I go to install it, because right now the dowels, that piece of ply is so thin, the dowels are pushing it up a little bit. But you can see with all of those 3 pieces in place, with how far this comes out, it comes out almost 24 inches. It's actually still pretty sturdy, so it was worth all the troubleshooting at the end of the day.